The sense of suffocation was constant. Bills were piling up, and the debt seemed to grow with each passing day. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, and I could no longer ignore the collection notices. My salary barely covered the basics, and any hope for a solution seemed to slip through my fingers. Frustration and desperation had become part of my daily life. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I came across the ad. I was browsing through an obscure job site, one of many that popped up in unreliable search results, hoping to find something that could alleviate my situation. The ad stood out on a dark background, with red letters that caught the eye. They were looking for a night guard for a remote guardhouse on the road, with a salary that seemed exorbitant for such a simple job. The ad's text was vague and enigmatic. Work in a quiet and secure environment, it said, responsible for checking and monitoring traffic on the road. There wasn't much information about what I would actually have to do, beyond a vague description about security. The idea of spending nights in a guardhouse in the middle of nowhere seemed odd, but the salary was a beacon of hope I couldn't ignore. At that moment, any job seemed better than the financial nightmare I was living through. The lack of options pushed me to accept the job. I filled out the application, sent in my documents, and to my surprise, received a response almost immediately. They were eager to hire me and wanted me to start as soon as possible. The following morning arrived with a mix of relief and apprehension. I drove to the job site, following the instructions I had been given. The road seemed endless, and as I moved further from the city, the scenery became increasingly desolate. Finally, I spotted the guardhouse, a small, isolated structure surrounded by vast darkness. The first night was strangely quiet. The wind howled and the road was empty, as if the world had retreated to leave only emptiness. Shadows danced on the walls of the guardhouse, and the sound of an occasional ominous thud made me wonder if I had made the right decision. But the salary was good, and I desperately needed this job. So, I pushed aside the doubts and prepared for what seemed like a long and solitary watch. The first nights were a mix of monotony and unease. The guardhouse was small and rudimentary, but it had the basics I needed: a chair, a table, and a window overlooking the deserted road. As the hours passed, the routine set in. My job was simple: monitor the passing vehicles and ensure everything was in order. The road seemed endless, and the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant car. At first, it was easy to stay focused. Traffic on the road was sparse, with only a few vehicles passing by during the night. But soon I began to notice some peculiarities. Vehicles would pass in an irregular manner, appearing and disappearing into the darkness without clear explanation. On other occasions, I would see people with strange behaviors. Some drove slowly, as if waiting for something, while others would stop briefly before continuing on. There was something unsettling about the way they looked at the guardhouse, as if they saw something I couldn't. The oddities became more frequent. Sometimes I would see cars making abrupt turns and returning on the road after a brief pause. On one particularly uncomfortable night, a vehicle with its headlights off approached slowly, stopped for a few seconds, and then sped away suddenly, disappearing into the darkness. The sense that something was wrong was palpable, but I struggled to find a logical explanation for the behavior of the vehicles and people. The environment around the guardhouse began to feel increasingly oppressive. The darkness seemed to grow denser, and the wind, which had been a mere whisper, now sounded like a constant wail. Sometimes, the sound of something hitting the guardhouse would make me jump from my seat, only to find that it was just a leaf being blown by the wind. But even these small noises became unsettling in my solitary nights. I started to feel constantly on edge, as if an invisible presence was watching me. The feeling of discomfort grew with each passing night, and the strange sensation of being watched wouldn't leave me. The guardhouse, which was supposed to be my refuge, was turning into a prison. The hours dragged on, and the threatening silence seemed to deepen, heightening my anxiety. Something was forming in the darkness, and I couldn't ignore the growing sense that the deserted road hid much more than I could imagine. Over the weeks, what had started as an unusual routine began to transform into a real nightmare. The vehicles passing along the road became increasingly disturbing. At first, it was just small details, a broken headlight here, a smear of dirt on a car window there. But soon, the visitors began to defy logic and common sense. One of the first signs that something was deeply wrong was the appearance of an old car, a model that seemed to have come straight out of a horror movie. It would pass by at the same time every night, never stopping or slowing down. The car was covered in rust and dust, and its headlights seemed almost opaque. There was something unsettling about the way the driver appeared to have no face, just an impenetrable shadow where the head should have been. The unexplained events began to accumulate. One night, while watching the road through the guardhouse window, I heard a sound that seemed to come from inside the guardhouse itself, a muffled thud followed by an almost imperceptible whisper. I got up, expecting to find some logical explanation, but everything was in order. However, the noise persisted, as if someone were whispering incomprehensible words outside the wall. The sound made my blood run cold, and I couldn't locate its source. Things only got worse. On one particularly dark night, a strange chill began to envelop the guardhouse. The windows started to tremble, and I saw objects moving on their own, as if an invisible force were playing with them. The radio, which was turned off, switched on by itself and began to transmit intermittent static, followed by a distorted voice whispering words in a language I didn't recognize. I began to have disturbing visions. Whenever I closed my eyes, it was like flashes of horrifying scenes, a hooded figure standing in the road, a shadow moving toward the guardhouse, and distorted faces that seemed to scream silently. These visions would wake me up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, only to find myself alone, in silence, with fear and paranoia building up. The feeling that something was terribly wrong intensified with each passing night. I tried to convince myself it was just stress and lack of sleep, but reality was unraveling around me. The apparitions and inexplicable events began to intertwine with a growing sense that the road was becoming a nightmarish place, where logic and reason were being eroded by a terrifying presence. Each night seemed more sinister than the last, and the reassurance that I was merely going through a rough patch seemed to dissipate, leaving me with a visceral and growing fear that something indescribable was about to happen. The tension began to build, and the strange events became increasingly frequent and intense. The environment around me seemed to be turning into a tangible nightmare. Each night brought new manifestations of terror. The guardhouse lights flickered more often, and the inexplicable sounds grew louder and more aggressive. I could feel the presence of something malevolent, like an oppressive shadow stretching across the deserted road. Then, a mysterious driver appeared. The car was a dark sedan with tinted windows, and it seemed to materialize out of nowhere, as if pulled from the darkness. The car would pass slowly by the guardhouse, always at the same time, and I could feel the occupant's eyes weighing on me, even though I couldn't see who was inside. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. The car, nearly invisible in the shadows, seemed to always be there, somewhere out of my direct line of sight. The tension reached a critical point when the car began to follow me. The first time I noticed, I thought it was just a coincidence. But when the car drove slowly by the guardhouse, stopping and turning around several times, I knew something was wrong. The sensation of being watched and followed was palpable. The car began to appear more frequently, and the occupant's behavior seemed increasingly threatening. Attempts to escape and seek help were thwarted. In the middle of the night, I tried to call the police, hoping a unit could come to me. But to my surprise, the communication lines were cut. The phone had no signal, and any attempt to use a radio or cell phone only resulted in disturbing static. The feeling of helplessness grew, and I felt completely isolated. My attempt to escape was also in vain. I decided to leave the guardhouse and head to a nearby town, But when I tried to drive down the road, the dark car appeared in front of me, blocking the way. I swerved the wheel and returned to the guardhouse, desperate. The surrounding roads were empty, as if the world around me was disintegrating. The mysterious car seemed always a few steps behind me, like a constant presence that couldn't be ignored. The sense of terror was overwhelming and persistent. With every attempt to escape, the threat became more real, more imminent. I was trapped in a cycle of fear, with no way to contact the outside world and no visible escape route. The growing feeling that my life was in imminent danger was terrifying. Each night, the presence of the dark car and the sensation of being hunted made the environment even more oppressive and desperate. The road that once seemed like a simple isolated route was now turning into a labyrinth of terror, and I was stuck in the middle of it, at the mercy of a threat that seemed to intensify with each passing moment. The night was particularly oppressive, and I knew something was about to happen. The dark car, which had been chasing me for days, reappeared with an intensity that left me paralyzed. The blinding headlights and the sound of the engine reminded me every second that the threat was closer than ever. When the chase began, the feeling of panic became overwhelming. I ran away from the guardhouse, desperately seeking some kind of refuge. The car accelerated behind me, and I felt that my only chance of survival was to find a safe place as quickly as possible. The deserted road seemed endless, and every turn felt like a trap ready to capture me. As I ran, I tried to keep my head cool and think of an escape plan. Finally, I spotted a gas station in the distance, a beacon of light in the darkness, which seemed to be my only hope. The sense that I was being pursued by someone with deadly intentions drove me forward with desperate force. The run to the gas station was agonizing. The car kept advancing behind me, and the fear of being captured was crushing. When I finally reached the gas station, I ran to the small convenience store and entered without hesitation. The clerk, surprised by my desperate appearance, immediately called the police while I tried to explain what was happening. The minutes felt like hours as we waited for the authorities to arrive. The pursuer's car parked outside the gas station but did not approach. When the police finally arrived, the car was empty and the driver had vanished. The tire marks on the road and signs of a struggle were evident, but the suspect was missing. The police conducted a thorough investigation, collecting evidence and asking about the events of the night. I was exhausted and traumatized, but I could still see concern in the officer's eyes. The gas station and the surrounding area were examined, but no concrete clues about the pursuer's identity or motivation were found. Despite the investigation, the case remained shrouded in mystery. The threat had disappeared, but the fear that something more sinister might be lurking remained. The relief of having escaped was mixed with the unease that the chase might have been just the beginning of something darker. The story ends on an ambiguous note. The investigation did not lead to any definitive conclusions, and the case remains open, leaving a sinister question: who was the driver, and what were their true intentions? The road and the gas station now carry the weight of an unresolved story, haunting all those who have heard about the night when the escape for survival turned into a real struggle.